The first time the whole room laughed at me. I was 16 years old and standing beside a torn anatomy poster with my hands still half raised in the air. It was third period biology in late October. The sort of damp Tennessee morning when everyone came into school smelling faintly like wet hoodies and cafeteria syrup. Mrs. Abernathy had asked a simple question. Nothing philosophical. Nothing profound. What do you want to be doing 10 years from now? That was it. A warm-up exercise before we started a unit on the circulatory system. Most of the room answered the way teenagers do when they haven't yet understood that other people are already using their uncertainty against them. Teacher. Mechanics. Cosmetologist. Army. Stay-home mom. Nurse. Football coach. Maybe Nashville if my cousin can get me in somewhere. Then Mrs. Abernathy pointed at me. Nora. I remember sitting up straighter. Not because I was confident. Because I had spent my whole childhood waiting for the rare moment when hope felt less embarrassing than silence. I want to be a doctor. I said. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just clear. And for one long second, and the room went still enough that I actually thought maybe nobody was going to say anything. Then someone snorted. Then a chair squeaked. Then a boy in the back started laughing so hard he slapped his desk. And after that, the whole room went with him. Not every single person. There are always one or two who don't join in. But they rarely matter in the moment. What matters is the sound of 20 people deciding, all at once, that your future is a joke? Mrs. Abernathy did that weak little teacher thing where she said, all right, while smiling too much. As if ridicule becomes harmless if the adult moderating it looks amused enough. I stood there in my Walmart sneakers and thrift store hoodie, staring at the circulation chart behind her shoulder and pretending not to notice who started it. But I knew. Of course I knew. Trente Mercer. He was the kind of boy small towns produce with exhausting consistency. Tall early, broad-shouldered by junior year. Hair always a little too perfect for someone pretending not to care. Son of a roofing contractor who owned half the church softball field sponsorships in our county and walked through public life like he had already inherited a forgiving audience. Trent didn't just laugh. He leaned back in his chair, shook his head, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear. From where? The trailer park clinic. And that was the line that broke the room open. Because if there is one thing teenagers know exactly how to weaponize, it is class. I lived in Cedar Ridge Mobile Estates with my mother and younger brother. Everyone knew it. They knew my mom worked double shifts at the nursing home and cleaned church offices on Saturdays for extra cash. They knew my dad had disappeared when I was 9 and reappeared twice after that. Both times to promise structure and leave unpaid utility bills instead. They knew my jeans came from Goodwill on the county line, and my lunch sometimes looked like leftovers in a margarine tub because my mother would rather die than let us buy cafeteria pizza on credit. So when Trent said trailer park clinic, he wasn't just mocking my dream. He was placing me back inside the social slot everyone had already assigned me. Poor girl. Quiet girl. Smart. But not that kind of smart. The kind that helps other people with homework and still somehow never gets mistaken for future success. I remember my face burning so hard I could feel it behind my eyes. Mrs. Abernathy told Trent to be quiet. He gave that little shrug boys like him give when adults have never made consequences feel real. Then he smiled at me and said, hey, maybe she can be like one of those TV doctors. A girl near the window added, "Yeah, if they let you in med school wearing Skechers." More laughter. And that should have been the end of it. That should have been the kind of ugly high school moment you survive and eventually reduce to a story told over wine when adulthood has given you enough distance from your old wounds to make them decorative. But shame doesn't work like that. Especially not public shame. Public shame becomes architecture. It teaches you where the room believes you belong. And if you're not careful, it can become the blueprint for your entire life. To explain why 10 years later, I was the doctor standing over Trent Mercer's mother in the emergency room while he looked at me like fate had developed a cruel sense of humor. I have to take you back before that classroom. Before Trent. Before biology. Back to the trailer park itself. Back to the first time I learned that wanting more than your environment permits can make people angrier than failure ever does. Cedar Ridge sat just outside Ashby, Tennessee, where the road dipped low near the drainage creek, and every hard rain made the gravel lanes smell like mud, rust, and old engines. In summer, the aluminum sides of the trailers threw heat back into the air, so hard it felt like the whole place was simmering. In winter, the wind found every cheap seam and reminded you hourly that poverty is often just insulation with a bad attitude. Our trailer was third from the end. Lot 18. 2 bedrooms. A kitchen so narrow my mother and I had to turn sideways to pass each other. Brown carpet with a permanent dark patch near the vent where my father once spilled transmission fluid and never properly cleaned it. A front step that dipped slightly left because my mother kept saying she would ask Mr. Harlan from Lot 6 to fix it when she had the money to pay him right. I shared a room with my brother Caleb until I was 13. He was 5 years younger. All elbows and cowlicks and huge eyes that always seemed to ask whether the world was about to become less stable again. By then I already knew the answer. Usually no. Sometimes yes. Never enough warning. My mother, Delia, worked harder than any human being should have to in order to remain one bad week from disaster. She did nights at Rosewood Nursing and Rehab, where the fluorescent lighting gave everyone the same exhausted complexion. And on off days, she cleaned the First Baptist administrative offices because the church secretary had once told her she had such a trustworthy face. That was the kind of praise poor women get in place of structural help. Trustworthy face. Strong back. Sweet spirit. No one ever called my mother lucky. No one ever called her rested. But everyone loved to call her good. Good is a dangerous word for women like her. It often means useful to everyone except themselves. When I was little, before I fully understood money, I thought being good might save us. By 10, I knew better. Good did not keep the power on. Good did not stop men from leaving. Good did not replace school shoes or pay the dentist or fix the muffler or cover the copay when Caleb got that ear infection that kept him crying for 4 nights straight. What good did do, I learned, was make everyone expect endurance without complaint. Still, my mother loved medicine, in a way she never had the chance to pursue properly. She was not a nurse. She wanted to be once. But life had other opinions. She became a certified nursing assistant at 19 because it was fast, local, and paid a little more than the diner. But at home, she spoke about nurses and doctors with the kind of reverence some people reserve for saints or astronauts. People trust them on the worst day of their lives. She used to say, that means something. At night, when she came home smelling like disinfectant, lotion, and the stale coffee from the staff break room, she'd tell me stories. Not confidential ones. Human honest. About a woman with dementia who still remembered every lyric to Patsy Cline songs. A man with emphysema who cried when someone braided his granddaughter's hair beside his bed. A nurse practitioner who caught a reaction no one else had noticed because she looked twice. Those stories lodged somewhere deep in me. Not because they were glamorous. Because they were precise. Medicina. Even in the limited corners, I saw it from childhood. Looked like the opposite of chaos. Pain came in. Knowledge met it. Sometimes people still died. But not because no one noticed. Not because no one was paying attention. That mattered to me more than I knew then. When home is unstable, competence starts to look holy. By 7th grade, I spent lunch periods in the library reading old anatomy textbooks donated from the community college. The diagrams fascinated me. Tendons, valves, chambers, pressure, rhythm. Nothing in the body seemed random once you studied it long enough. Even failure obeyed patterns. At 14, I started volunteering after school at Rosewood because Mom said they needed help refilling water pitchers and sorting activity supplies for residents. I pushed carts, delivered puzzle books, folded blankets, and learned quickly which rooms liked conversation and which liked quiet. One of the LPNs there, Ms. Janice, caught me once, staring too long at a blood pressure cuff and laughed. "You planning to steal my job, baby?" I said. "No. Mom, bigger." She grinned. "How big?" "Doctor." And do you know what she said? "Not that's unrealistic." "Not from here? Not with what money?" She said. "Then stop standing there and learn how to spell sphygmomanometer." I loved her for that before I had the language to say why. People think encouragement always sounds warm. It doesn't. Sometimes it sounds like being taken seriously on the first try. School was where seriousness died. Ashby High was red brick, underfunded, and arranged socially according to the same rules as every small southern town that insists it is classless while ranking everyone by surname. Church attendance, and who still has their original teeth. If your family owned land, you started with advantages, people called respect. If your dad coached Little League, you inherited friendliness by association. If your mother chaired the Christmas bazaar, teachers described you as coming from a good family, even when you cheated on tests and got caught with dip in the ag shed bathroom. And if you lived in Cedar Ridge, your intelligence was treated like an odd decorative trait. Nice for trivia bowls. Slightly embarrassing if it made you ambitious. Trent Mercer understood those rules instinctively. He was not the most vicious boy at school. That distinction matters. The openly vicious ones are easier to spot and eventually easier to dismiss. Trent was worse in a quieter way. He was socially fluent, funny when adults could hear, cruel when they couldn't. The kind of boy girls forgave because he smiled with his whole face, and boys followed because he never looked uncertain for longer than a blink. His mother, Sandra Mercer, taught 3rd grade at the elementary school. Everyone loved her. She sent handwritten thank you notes, made pecan pies for church auctions, and called people sweetheart without sounding fake. That mattered later. Alot. Trent and I had known each other since middle school. When he realized I was useful during group projects and humiliating during everything else, he'd ask for help with homework after class. All polite and low-voiced, like we were allies. Then, in front of people, he'd turn me into a punchline. My handwriting, my lunch, my old phone, The fact that I kept my chemistry notes in reused manila folders because new binders cost money. In freshman year, he once asked whether I highlighted textbooks because books are the only things in your house worth more than the furniture. Everyone laughed. Ava May. A little. That's how survival works at 16. Sometimes you laugh at your own diminishment because choosing not to laugh makes the room feel even longer. By sophomore year, I had become what schools love to call mature, meaning I learned how to disappear strategically. Sit front row. Speak when called on. Leave quickly. Never linger near lockers where Trent and his friends could smell weakness like dogs smell weather. The problem with strategic invisibility is that it can help you survive adolescence while quietly teaching you that your best chance at peace is self-erasure. That biology class cracked something in me. Not immediately in a cinematic way. I didn't storm out and make a speech. I didn't tell Trent he'd regret it. I didn't become some overnight revenge machine built from humiliation and grit. No, what actually happened was uglier and more ordinary. I sat down, kept my face still, finished the bell work, went to fourth period algebra. Then I walked to the girls' bathroom during lunch, locked myself in the far stall, and cried so hard, I bit my knuckles to stay quiet. That was the day shame changed shape for me. Before then, shame was mostly domestic. Utility shut-off notices. Wearing shoes too small because you had one more month in them if you just loosened the laces. Watching your mother count 20s and 5s at the table while pretending she wasn't deciding which bill deserved electricity more. After that class, shame became public. A room full of people agreeing your dream did not fit your address. When I got home that afternoon, Mom was asleep before her shift, curled on top of the blanket in scrubs with one sock on and one off. Mouth slightly open from exhaustion. Caleb was at the neighbor's, so the trailer was quiet. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the cracked vinyl floor and thought, maybe they're right. That is the sentence every underdog story likes to skip past because it sounds weak. It isn't weak. It is honest. Of course I thought maybe they were right. When the whole room laughs, it is arrogant not to doubt yourself, at least a little. I sat at the table and opened my biology notebook. Then I saw what I had written at the top of the page that morning while Mrs. Abernathy was still taking attendance. Cardiologist? I had put a question mark after it. Not because I was unsure about medicine, because I wasn't yet sure which part of medicine felt most like destiny instead of fantasy. I stared at that little question mark for a long time. Then I crossed it out. Not the word, just the question mark. That was the first act of revenge. Though I didn't know it then. Not proving them wrong. Refusing to let their laughter decide the punctuation of my future. That night, when Mom woke up and saw my face, she knew something had happened. Mothers like mine always know. They just don't always have the luxury of stopping life long enough to fix it properly. What did somebody say? She asked. I shrugged. Because humiliation spoken aloud often grows teeth. She waited. So I told her. Not every line. Not every laugh. Just enough. There was a long silence after I finished. Then she sat down across from me, still in wrinkled scrubs, and said something I have carried ever since. Bobby, people mock the dream. They can't imagine fitting inside your life. That says more about their imagination than your future. I looked at her. You really think I could do it? She held my gaze. I think if you don't, it won't be because they were right. That mattered. Notice what she didn't say. Not yes. Absolutely. No problem. Not everything is possible if you work hard enough. Poor people know better than that. We know structure exists. We know talent is not a coupon code for suffering. We know debt can suffocate and luck matters, and some doors stay closed because a stranger in admissions liked another essay better. No, my mother gave me something more useful than fantasy. She gave me responsibility back. If I failed, let it be from reality, not surrender. After that, I got meaner in a private way. Not cruel. Disciplined. I turned embarrassment into schedule. AP biology flashcards on the bus. SAT vocabulary in line at the laundromat. Anatomy videos at the public library, because our internet at home ran on prayer and bad weather. I started waking at 5 to study before Caleb got up, because once he was awake, the trailer belonged to cereal bowls, missing socks, and survival. At school, I became more quiet and more dangerous, academically. Teachers who had smiled too softly in the wake of that biology incident started blinking when my grades came back. Trent noticed too. Success changes the flavor of bullying. It doesn't always stop it. Sometimes it just turns it sharper. Junior year. When I made the highest chemistry grade in class, he said, "Guess med school accepts charity cases now." Senior year. When I got into a summer enrichment program in Nashville for first-generation pre-med students, he looked over my acceptance packet and said, "You know that's probably just diversity stuff, right?" He wasn't stupid. That's the part people get wrong about boys like Trent. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every insult had a built-in alibi. Just joking. Just saying. Just being honest. That phrase alone has hidden more cowardice than most locked rooms. The teachers mostly let it pass because Trent performed decency well for adults. He held doors, called women ma'am, and played enough football that every hallway authority figure had already decided his flaws were seasoning, not danger. Meanwhile, I carried around my future like contraband. By senior year, I had my list. UT Knoxville for pre-med, if I could make the scholarship work. MTSU, as a backup. Community college plus transfer if money came in crueler than usual. Every option looked fragile. Every envelope looked expensive before it was even opened. Sometimes at night, I would sit on the trailer steps after Caleb went to bed and calculate tuition scenarios with a flashlight and notebook while frogs clicked near the drainage ditch. I understood debt before I understood romance. Understood FAFSA before I had ever been kissed properly. Understood that one good grade could not save you. But 10,000 boring good decisions might. That was the difference between kids like me and kids like Trent. He treated future success like inheritance. I treated it like emergency engineering. The spring of senior year, there was a college and career assembly in the gym. Folding chairs. Banners for local trade schools. Recruiters in polo shirts. The guidance counselor, Mr. Pettu, stood at the mic and asked a few of us to say where we were headed. When he called my name, I almost stayed seated. Not from fear exactly. From memory, I still knew what public laughter sounded like. But I stood anyway. University of Tennessee. I said, biochemistry. Scattered claps. Then Mr. Petty asked, because apparently adults love setting girls up inside rooms full of teenage cruelty. And long term? I looked out over the gym. Over Trent and his friends in the middle rows. Over girls who had watched me be a joke for years and boys who preferred me useful and quiet. And I said, medical school? This time the laughter wasn't as loud. That mattered too. Not because they believed in me. Because repetition wears grooves in public imagination. Once a person keeps saying the same improbable thing with enough consistency, the room starts losing the energy to mock it at full volume. Still. Trent clapped slowly and shouted, "Call me when you need a patient." People laughed again. But less. That was my first taste of what long revenge actually looks like. Not one big triumph. Attrition. The slow exhaustion of other people's certainty. I left Ashby 3 months later with 1 rolling suitcase, 2 garbage bags, a scholarship package that still left terrifying gaps, and $48. My mother tucked into my palm at the Greyhound station, like she was smuggling me out of one life and into another. College was not inspiring. I need to say that plainly. People like neat underdog stories because they imagine the second act is montage. It isn't. It is hunger and fluorescent libraries, and pretending not to hear when roommates ask what your family does, and not knowing whether they mean for money or in general. Knoxville was bigger than any world I had lived in before, and lonelier than I expected. The first semester I worked at the campus dining hall breakfast shift, cleaned tables in the student union on weekends, and took 17 credit hours because dropping 1 class would have changed my aide status. I learned fast that being smart in a rural high school and being pre-med at a flagship university are 2 very different kinds of survival. Everyone in my chemistry sequence had been brilliant somewhere. Everyone had been the hardworking one or the gifted one, or the kid adults pointed at as proof that merit still meant something. Now we were all in the same lecture hall under strip lights, failing quizzes together in decorative new ways. The first time I got a C on an organic chemistry exam, I sat outside the science library in freezing rain and genuinely considered quitting. Not the class. The whole dream. Because I could hear Ashby in my head. Trailer park clinic. TV doctor. Charity case. And when your old humiliation lines up too neatly with your current exhaustion, it becomes very easy to mistake struggle for prophecy. What saved me was not motivation. It was structure again. Office hours. Study group. An older black med student named Imani who worked in the tutoring center and looked at my exam like it was a repair manual instead of a verdict. "You're not bad at this," she said. "You're undertrained and scared." That sentence changed my life. Undertrained and scared. Not inadequate. Not fraudulent. Not proof that the laughter had seen something real in me after all. Just undertrained and scared. God. I loved accurate people. I stayed. Retook nothing. Improved. Worked harder. Slept less. By junior year, I was tutoring freshman biology and volunteering in the ER at University Medical Center. Not glamorous work. Stocking gloves. Restocking carts. Wiping chairs in waiting areas after anxious families left coffee rings and grief behind. But I loved the rhythm of the emergency department. The urgency. The hierarchy. The way every person in the room had to translate panic into action fast, or people paid for it physically. It felt, strangely, like home done correctly. Pain entered. Competence met it. Not always enough. But honestly, I called Mom after my first shift there. She cried before I finished describing the trauma bay doors. Caleb, meanwhile, was growing into a funny, lopsided teenager who acted like my college life was half superhero movie, half accounting error. He texted me things like, Do doctors have to know every bone or just the gross ones? And if I break my arm in a cool way, will you get extra credit? He was one of the reasons I kept going. Not because I wanted him to worship me. Because younger siblings deserve proof that escape can have a map. Medical school was harder. Of course it was harder. People say that too casually, as if hard is one texture. Medical school is not one texture. It is humiliation, ava, sleep deprivation, bureaucracy, blood, anatomy lab preservatives, imposter syndrome, and the slow erosion of every romantic idea you had about your own endurance. It is being brilliant and stupid in the same hour. It is watching someone die at 4:12 a.m. sis. And then taking a quiz on electrolyte imbalances at 8, because institutions do not pause for your emotional timetable. I got into Vanderbilt. Even now, saying that feels unreal. Not because I doubt I earned it. Because I know exactly what 16-year-old me would have heard in those syllables. Impossible. I was 22. My mother drove me to Nashville in her second-hand Buick with the check engine light on and 3 lasagna pans wrapped in towels in the trunk because feeding me was the one protection she could still afford to overperform. She stood in my apartment doorway after helping me unpack and touched the white coat folded over a chair like it was made of church linen. "Your whole life?" she said. "People kept acting like you needed permission." I looked at her. She smiled through tears. "You didn't." I carried that line too. All the way through first-year anatomy. All the way through step prep. All the way through the night in third year, when I threw up behind the hospital after my first pediatric code and then went back inside because another patient was waiting. People talk about becoming a doctor like it is achievement. Sometimes it feels more like controlled disintegration with a license attached. But somewhere along the way, the dream stopped being revenge. That surprised me. Not entirely, but enough. For years, success had worn Trent Mercer's face in my imagination. Every exam passed was a reply. Every acceptance letter was a correction. Every white coat ceremony was me walking farther away from that classroom laugh. Then patients entered the story. Riellones. A woman with sepsis who squeezed my wrist after I caught her medication allergy before the attending saw it. A construction worker who cried because he thought chest pain meant he would never hold his daughter again. A grandmother with atrial fibrillation who kept apologizing for making trouble while her heart fluttered itself toward danger. The work got bigger than the wound. That mattered. Because if you build your entire life as revenge, eventually you discover revenge is too small a room for sustained greatness. Still, old humiliations do not disappear. They just become quieter until the right voice wakes them. I had not seen Trent Mercer in person in nearly a decade. Not since high school graduation. When he hugged half the gym and ignored me completely, which was somehow worse than one final insult. I heard things over the years. Of course. That he stayed local. That he worked for his dad's roofing company. Then took over some operations when Mr. Fiven with her LibriVox. Mercer got sick. That he married a girl 2 years behind us named Kayla and had a daughter. That he coached pee-wee football and still looked good in public, which in small towns counts as a moral trait more often than anyone admits. Sometimes Mom would mention his mother. "Mrs. Mercer asked about you at Food City." Or, "Sandra Mercer told me she always knew you were bright." That one made me laugh so hard I nearly dropped a fork. People love retroactive faith in success. Once you've made it far enough to become socially useful as an anecdote, Everyone suddenly remembers believing in you. By the time I turned 30, I was an emergency medicine attending in Nashville. Not a resident anymore. Not the lowest voice in the room. Board certified, independent, tired in a more permanent and better paid way. My mother still worked too hard. Though less than before. Caleb was finishing trade school and dating a girl with pink hair and honest eyes. I had a condo with decent plumbing. One ficus. I kept almost alive. And a habit of falling asleep in scrubs with charting half-finished on my laptop. From the outside, it probably looked like I had won. And in many ways, I had. But victory is not always what people think. Sometimes victory is just ordinary peace after years of being underestimated. Sometimes it is being too busy helping strangers live to keep replaying old cafeteria laughter. And sometimes, just when you think the wound has scarred over cleanly, life wheels your past through the ambulance bay doors at 2:13 inches the morning. That night started like any other bad ER night. 3 flu admissions holding in hallway beds because inpatient was full. One drunk guy with a forehead laceration, insisting he knew the governor personally. A toddler with croup. A dialysis patient, short of breath. A trauma alert we all expected to be catastrophic and turned out, mercifully, to be mostly broken glass and panic. I was 5 hours into a 12-hour shift and halfway through a protein bar that tasted like sweet drywall when EMS called ahead with another incoming 7. Female, late 50s, chest pain, hypotension, diaphoretic, en route, 8 minutes. Nothing unusual on the surface. Until they said the last name. Mercer. I remember freezing for half a second. Not because Mercer is rare in Tennessee, but because the medic added, almost casually, family member on scene says she has a history of arrhythmia, but tonight she collapsed at home. Family member on scene? My whole body knew before my mind agreed. Mercer. Mother. Night collapse. I looked up from the workstation just as the automatic doors at the end of the bay opened to another gurney rolling in. And beside it, pale under the fluorescent lights, eyes wild with helplessness, was Trent Mercer. For one stupid, disorienting second, the emergency room disappeared. Not literally. I still heard the monitor alarms. Still smelled antiseptic and stale coffee and the sharp electric tang of an open defibrillator cart nearby. But memory moved faster than medicine for half a heartbeat. I saw a biology classroom. A torn anatomy poster. A boy laughing with his whole mouth. Then training hit the brakes. Hard. I stepped forward. Move her into Bay 4. I said. My voice came out flat and clean. Exactly the way I wanted. Not cold. Controlled. The stretcher rolled past me and I looked down. Sandra Mercer. Older. Of course. Paler than I had ever seen her. Skin damp with sweat. Lips slightly blue at the edges. Hair half fallen from what had probably been a neat-at-home style before collapse and ambulance straps rearranged everything. Her eyes were open, but not tracking well. Ma'am, can you hear me? I asked. A weak sound. Nothing more. The paramedic was already giving report. 58-year-old female. Sudden onset chest pain at home about 20 minutes ago. Then, syncopal episode. EMS found her hypotensive. Tachycardic. Altered but responsive. History from family includes atrial fibrillation. Hypertension. Possible prior ablation about 6 years ago. Initial rhythm, wide complex tachycardia, fluctuating, pressure's been dropping. I nodded. Animets? The medic rattled them off. I caught half on instinct, half on repetition. Apixaban. Metoprolol. Something for blood pressure. Maybe a recent antibiotic. Not enough yet. Never enough in the first 60 seconds. I was already moving. Get me a repeat 12. Lead. Large bore 4 if she doesn't already have 2. CBC. CMP. Troponin. Mug. Lactate. Type and screen. Bedside ultrasound ready. And page cardiology now. Not later. The nurses moved. That's one of the holy things about emergency medicine when it works. No one needs your autobiography. They just need clarity. Sandra Mercer became my patient before she became anyone's mother. That mattered. It had to matter. But then Trent stepped into my peripheral vision. Not close enough to interfere. Just close enough to be unavoidable. He had one hand half raised, like he wasn't sure whether he was allowed to touch the bed. And there was something so nakedly terrified in his face that if I had met him for the first time that night, I might have felt sorry for him immediately. Instead, what I felt was stranger. Recognition. Not of him as he was now. Of the impossible collision between who he had been and what this moment required from me. He recognized me at the same time. I saw it happen. The slight widening of the eyes. The falter. The quick, involuntary scan of my face, as if trying to align the girl from Ashby High with the attending physician standing in navy scrubs under trauma bay lights. He said my name once. Not doctor. Not excuse me. Not please. Just Nora. I didn't look at him. Not because I was trying to punish him. Because if you split your attention in an emergency room for the wrong reason, people bleed for it. What exactly happened before she passed out? I asked. And still looking at Sandra. Trent swallowed. We were at home. She said she felt pressure in her chest. Then she got lightheaded. Then she just folded. Any fall? Head strike? I caught her before she hit the counter. Good. Maybe. Maybe not. One thing at a time. Sandra moaned when we shifted her for lead placement. Her monitor was ugly. Not the clean dramatic lines TV likes. Real ugly. Chaotic. Unstable. The kind of rhythm that makes the room tighten before anyone says why. The EKG printed. I glanced down. Then again. Not straightforward STEMI. Not simple AFib with RVR either. She was electrically messy and clinically worse than I liked. Pressure falling. Skin cold. Something spiraling fast. I stepped to the bedside and called her name louder. Mrs. Mercer. Sandra. Look at me. Her eyes fluttered toward my voice. That was enough. A tiny line of access between her body and my instructions. Do you have pain right now? A whisper. Yes. Can you tell me where? She lifted one weak hand toward the center of her chest. I nodded. Okay, we're going to take care of you. That sentence always sounds more certain than it feels. But patients deserve steadiness even when you are building the plane midair. The nurse read out her blood pressure. Worse. I made the call. Pat's on. If she tips any further. Vicardiovert. Trent took one involuntary step forward. Is she having a heart attack? That question. That thin strip of hope people try to fit under even the worst possibilities. I looked at him then. Really looked. And for a second, I saw both versions. The boy who laughed. The man whose mother might die before sunrise if we got this wrong. She's unstable. I said, we're treating her now. His mouth opened, like he wanted more words. There weren't more words. Not yet. I turned back. Bedside ultrasound. No massive pericardial effusion. Cardiac squeeze poor. Hard to tell in the speed of it. Lungs not the main story. This was rhythm. Perfusion. History. Collapse. Cardiology called back. I gave the fastest clean report of my life. They were on the way. I ordered synchronized cardioversion. Consent in true emergencies is often a brutal simplification of humanity. Not because you don't care. Because time does not. I explained it to Sandra as gently as I could, though I'm not sure how much she retained. I explained it to Trent too, because he was the family member present, and because despite everything else, panic deserves translation. Her heart rhythm is dangerous and her blood pressure is falling. I said, we need to shock the rhythm back into something safer. His face drained. You mean like... Yes. He nodded too fast. Whatever arrogance had lived in him at 16 was nowhere in that room now. The team moved like a body with multiple hands. Sedation. Charge. Clear. The shock lifted her off the bed by inches. Her rhythm changed. Not perfect. Better. Just enough better that the room loosened one notch from total disaster. I watched the monitor. Waited. Sandra took a ragged breath that sounded like someone re-entering her own body through a narrow door. The nurse called out the pressure. Improving. Not safe yet. But improving. Those first small upward turns in a crashing patient's physiology never feel triumphant to me. They feel like being granted the right to continue trying. Trent braced one hand against the wall. I don't think he realized he was doing it. He looked at me and then away again. Like eye contact itself had become too expensive. For the next 20 minutes, I lived entirely inside medicine. Serial EKGs. Rate control considerations. Anticoag questions. History clarification. Cardiology at bedside. Decision for ICU admission and urgent further workup. There is a mercy in that kind of work when the past is standing 2 feet away. The body in crisis does not care about your history with the family member at bedside. It demands present competence, or it punishes everyone. By the time Sandra was stable enough to move upstairs, the adrenaline had left that hollow metallic taste in my mouth that always arrived after near misses. Not victory. Aftermath. Cardiology wanted her in the unit. Close monitoring. Possible catheterization in the morning depending on enzymes. Imaging. Rhythm, evolution. And how she held overnight, not out of danger, but alive. Alive because the room moved fast enough. Alive because training worked. Alive because I had not let a classroom ghost take over my hands. Once transport arrived, the nurses began their usual controlled cleanup. Used packaging. Disposable wrappers. Line secured. Orders signed. And for one brief, dangerous second, there was nothing left to do but stand in the same space as Trent Mercer. He was by the foot of the bed, looking at his mother with the stunned, vacant tenderness people wear when catastrophe has not fully finished entering the body yet. I started to step away. Then he said it. "I didn't know it was you." There are sentences that sound ridiculous the moment they leave someone's mouth and still reveal everything. I looked at him. What difference would that have made? He swallowed. "None," his face said. "Everything else, too." He stopped. Tried again. "I didn't know." No, he hadn't known. That was the point. Because people like Trent rarely imagine that the lives they mocked continue developing beyond the edge of their attention. I should have left then. Maybe a wiser woman would have. Maybe a cleaner story would have. But exhaustion strips you down to honesty sometimes. And I had been standing in fluorescent truth for too many hours to reach for politeness. "You laughed at me once," I said. His eyes closed briefly. Of course he remembered. Men like him always remember the injuries they hope other people have been graceful enough to bury. I was a kid. That old line. The world's cheapest disinfectant. I felt anger move through me then. But not the hot teenage kind. Something older. Sharper. Better trained. So was I. I said. He had nothing for that. Because there is no moral shelter in adolescence when the wound lasted longer for the target than the amusement did for the person delivering it. One of the ICU nurses signaled they were ready. Sandra's eyes opened briefly as they adjusted the bed rails. She looked from me to Trent and back again. Groggy and confused, but present enough to notice something strange in the air. "Do you know each other?" she whispered. I could have lied. It would have been easy. Safer. Probably. Kinder in the short term. But short-term kindness is often just deferred truth in nicer packaging. "Yes," I said. "We went to school together." Sandra studied my face through the haze. And then, slowly, recognition arrived. Not sharp at first. Then all at once, her mouth parted. "Norabelle?" No one had called me Norabelle in years. Not since the trailer park. Not since my mother still shouted my first and middle name through the screen door when dinner was ready. I nodded once. Sandra Mercer stared at me like she had just discovered a ghost with hospital privileges. "Oh," she said. Just that. "Oh." And in that one syllable lived 10 years of social distance. Old Town memory. Classroom cruelty. And the impossible fact that the girl from Cedar Ridge was now the physician who had just kept her alive long enough for mourning. They rolled her upstairs before anyone said more. When the doors closed behind the transport team, the bay suddenly looked too bright and too empty. Trent stayed where he was. I charted instead of speaking. That was not avoidance. That was survival. In emergency medicine, charting after a crisis is partly medicine, partly prayer, partly evidence that you were here and saw what happened before the next wave arrives to erase the edges. He waited until I signed the last order. Then he said, "Thank you." I nodded without looking up. Not because gratitude meant nothing, because it did not mean enough. He understood that. I think, or started to. "I don't know if you remember," he began. I looked at him then. Hard enough that he stopped. "Remember." As if there were any chance I had forgotten, the day an entire room agreed my future was ridiculous. As a matter of fact, I said, I do. He went pale. Good. Not because I wanted to crush him, because memory should finally have a cost on the right side of the table. A trauma pager went off down the hall. Somewhere a child cried. A monitor alarmed in another bay, and cut out again. Real life. Hula sewa. Moved around us. Trent looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically smaller. Spiritually. Like panic had removed the old easy certainty and left only a man in a baseball cap realizing the world had continued without asking his permission. I was awful to you, he said. That was the first honest thing he had ever said to me. Too late. Yes. Still honest. I leaned against the workstation and crossed my arms. Not out of posture, but because my body was suddenly very tired. Yes. I said. He nodded like he deserved the blow. He did. But deserved and useful are not the same thing. And I no longer had the energy to spend on his moral education. So I said nothing else. Eventually, he asked where his mother would be taken and what the next steps looked like. That, at least, I could answer. ICU first. Monitoring. Cardiology evaluation. Possible procedures depending on overnight changes. He listened carefully. Eyes fixed on my face now, in a way that would have infuriated 16-year-old me and bored 30-year-old me equally if the circumstances had been any less grave. When I finished, he said, "Thank you again." This time his voice broke a little. Then he left. And only when he was gone did I realize my hands were trembling. Not badly. Just enough. Enough to remind me that professionalism is not immunity. You can do the job well and still feel the collision afterward in your nerves. I went into the staff bathroom, locked the door, and stood over the sink. For 1 second, I let myself see it all together. The trailer, the classroom, the Greyhound station, organic chemistry in freezing rain, white coat, trauma bay lights, Sandra Mercer under my hands, Trent saying my name like it had been pulled through time against his will. Then I washed my face, went back out, and saw 4 more patients before dawn. Because that is adulthood too. Sometimes your biggest emotional reversal of the decade happens at 2:13 a.m. And by 2:46 you are telling a drunk man he needs stitches above the eyebrow, and no. Karaoke injuries are not a billing category. Sandra stayed in the ICU 2 days. Arrhythmia complication with underlying coronary disease. Ultimately, she needed intervention, medication adjustments, and more follow-up than Trent had probably ever imagined a heart could require until that week. I saw her again the following afternoon when I went upstairs between cases to check a lab result on another patient, and found her sitting up in bed. Color better. Glasses on. A paperback open but clearly unread in her lap. She saw me first. For one moment we just looked at each other. Then she said, softly, "I hoped it was you." That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because the sentence held so many possible meanings at once, and I had no idea which one she intended most. I stepped closer. "How are you feeling?" "Embarrassed," she said. Honest again. Interesting. Then she sighed and corrected herself. And sore, but mostly embarrassed. I checked her monitor, glanced at the chart, looked at the line sight. Did all the ordinary competent things because it's easier to stand inside role when history has suddenly become conversational. She watched me the whole time. Finally, she said, "Trent told me what happened in high school." I almost said, "I doubt he told you all of it." Instead, I said, "Did he?" She nodded. Her eyes filled. That startled me more than I expected. Because Sandra Mercer had occupied a strange place in my memory all these years. Not villain. Not innocent either. One of those beloved small-town mothers who float above the social ecosystem, her own child helps enforce because her own kindness is so publicly legible. She swallowed. "Nora, I am so sorry." There it was. The apology I had never known I wanted. Not from Trent. From one of the adults who had once lived close enough to the cruelty to maybe have seen its shape. If only she had looked sideways. I stood very still. She continued. "I used to hear things. Little comments. The way he said your name sometimes. I told myself boys are immature. That he'd grow out of it. That if it were serious, I'd know." She shut her eyes. That was easier than asking harder questions. That line hit like a small, clean knife. Because it was true far beyond her. Adults do this all the time. They downgrade what harms quiet children because the child survives it visibly enough to avoid becoming inconvenient. I said, "Yes." Not to be cold. To keep it accurate. Tears slid out from under her closed lashes. "He has a daughter now," she whispered. "And all I can think is if anyone ever made her feel small that way." She couldn't finish. Maybe that was justice too. Not revenge. Recognition. The awful kind that arrives only once the next generation gives you a face to imagine in the old wound. I adjusted the blanket at the end of her bed. Mostly to occupy my hands. "You should rest," I said. She nodded. But before I could leave, she reached for my wrist. Very lightly. Not enough to trap. Just enough to ask. "I really am sorry." I believed her. That complicated everything in the most human way possible. Because cruelty inherited through structures is often maintained by people who are not monstrous enough to fit our preferred stories about blame. Sandra had been kind. And still, her kindness had not protected me from her son. That mattered too. When I left the room, Trent was in the hallway by the vending machines holding 2 unopened ginger ales and looking like he had not slept properly in 48 hours. He straightened when he saw me. I kept walking. "Nora, wait." I stopped. Only because there were no patients in immediate distress, and because avoidance, for me, has always curdled into unfinished business. He came closer. But not too close. Good. People should have to earn distance. "My mom said she talked to you." "She did." He looked down at the cans in his hands, then back up. I was trying to remember exactly what I said in that class. I let that sit. Then I said, "You don't need to remember exactly. You were there." He nodded. His throat worked. "I think about high school sometimes, and it's like I was performing for people all the time. I didn't even—" He stopped. Exhaled. "That's not an excuse." No, it wasn't. But it was, perhaps, the first step toward a language that didn't flatter him while confessing. "I knew you were smart," he said quietly. "That was part of why I did it." I stared at him. There it was. The ugly clean center. Not ignorance. Recognition weaponized. He continued before I could respond. You were the kind of person who made me feel like the room might notice I wasn't as good as they already thought I was. I almost laughed. Not because it was absurd. Because it was so painfully ordinary. There are entire systems of cruelty built from mediocre men, panicking in the presence of gifted girls. And for years, the gifted girls are told to be less sensitive, while the men get praised for confidence. I said, "So you made me smaller?" He nodded. Yes. At least he had the decency to stop decorating it. I looked at him for a long moment. And somewhere inside that moment, 16-year-old me waited. Waited for the thrill. The humiliation returned. The collapse. The perfect revenge line. But adulthood is irritating that way. It rarely gives you the movie speech when you finally stand over the ruins of an old wound. What it gives you is choice. And my choice? Standing in that ICU hallway with ginger ale condensation ticking down a vending machine, was not to give Trent Mercer more of my life than he had already taken. So I said, "Your mother is lucky you called 911 fast." He blinked, probably expecting more. Maybe hoping for punishment because punishment would have given him a shape he understood. I offered none. Not forgiveness. Not comfort. Just truth angled back toward the woman he still had time to love better. Then I walked away. That should have been the end of it. In a neat story, maybe it would have been, but small towns and old wounds are communal organisms. They do not stay in one room if enough people know enough names. 3 weeks later, I drove down to Ashby for Thanksgiving. Mom had insisted. Caleb was bringing his pink-haired girlfriend, Leela, who turned out to make an excellent pecan pie and laugh with her whole body in a way that made our trailer feel less small. I almost said no to the trip because work had been brutal and I had no appetite for local nostalgia. But something in me wanted to see home again after the Mercer night. Maybe just to prove the old place no longer contained me the way it once had. Ashby looked the same. That was the strange part. The gas station near the highway still sold boiled peanuts under a hand-painted sign. The church marquee still promised a women's prayer breakfast and a canned food drive. The high school football field still glowed unnaturally bright against the dark. Time moves faster inside you than it does in hometowns. The day after Thanksgiving, Mom and I went to Food City because she had forgotten evaporated milk and refused to make sweet potato casserole with any substitute she regarded as morally unserious. We were in produce when I heard someone say my name. Not Nora Bell. Dr. Bell. I turned. Sandra Mercer stood by the apples in a camel coat. Color back in her face. A little thinner maybe, but upright. Alive, and looking at me with a softness so public, it almost embarrassed me. Beside her was Trent. He looked uncomfortable immediately. Good. Let public memory have witnesses this time too. Sandra came toward me with both hands clasped. Delia told me you were in town. My mother, halfway to the onions, froze with an expression I can only describe as alert, maternal interest sharpened by 20 years of poverty-trained vigilance. Yes. Ma'am, I said. Sandra nodded, eyes already glossy. I've been hoping to see you properly. Small towns adore proper scenes. This one, however, actually deserved itself. She took a breath. This woman saved my life, she said, loud enough that 2 people near the canned cranberries turned slightly. I felt heat climb up my neck instantly. Not because I was ashamed, because public reversal is its own kind of exposure. My mother looked from Sandra to me and back again. Trent stared at the floor like the tile had become a theological problem. Sandra kept going. And I need you to know something. When my son was younger, he was cruel to her. Cruel in ways I should have seen more clearly. And she still stood there and cared for me like I was any other patient in the world. The whole produce section did not go silent. Exactly. Real life is never that cooperative. But the air changed. You could feel a tension tilt. My mother's hand flew to her chest. Not dramatic. Instinctive. Trent looked like he wanted the automatic doors to open behind him and take him out into traffic. Sandra turned to my mother. Dahlia. I'm sorry too. My mother. God bless her. I did not reach for social smoothing the way so many women her age would have. She looked at Sandra for a long second and said, well, she always was tougher than people gave her credit for. I nearly cried right there beside the Honeycrisps. Not because it was sentimental. Because my mother had spent her whole life fighting privately, and in that moment she gave me public honor without making it smaller to keep anyone comfortable. Trent finally looked at me. I'm sorry, he said. Not in a hallway. Not with fluorescent lights and vending machines and plausible deniability. In the grocery store in our hometown. In public. Where the old humiliation had once lived. I studied his face. He meant it. I think he had meant it in the hospital too. In the limited way, some people first mean anything. But here, with witnesses and no medical crisis to hide behind. It cost more. That mattered. Still, apology is not erasure. I nodded once. Thank you. And that was all. No hug. No closure speech. No restoration of some fake childhood friendship we never had. Just an apology received into reality and left there. That was enough. Maybe more than enough. On the drive back to the trailer park, Mom kept glancing at me like she wanted to ask everything at once but was restraining herself for my sake. Finally, she said, "So, Dr. Bell." I laughed. The first real laugh of the whole week. Then I told her the story. All of it? The ambulance bay. The rhythm. The shock. Trente face. Sandra's apology. The hallway conversation. When I finished, Mom was quiet a long time. Then she said, "Funny thing about time? What? It doesn't usually punish people the way we hope. It just reveals them." I thought about that for the rest of the drive. She was right. Time had not turned Trent into a monster. It had turned him into a frightened son in a hallway forced to meet the person he once treated as disposable. Time had not turned me into vengeance in a white coat. It had turned me into the kind of physician who could keep an old wound from interfering with a woman's chance to live. That mattered more than any fantasy I had nursed at 17. Years have passed since then. I still work emergency medicine. Still lose sleep. Still eat protein bars that taste like drywall and call it dinner more nights than I should. Caleb married Lila. My mother finally cut her hours. Sometimes she still introduces me to people as my daughter the doctor, with enough pride to power a small county. And every now and then, someone from Ashby says, "You always knew, didn't you?" No, that's the thing. I didn't always know. I hoped. I worked. I failed some tests and passed others, and cried in bathrooms and questioned everything and kept going anyway. That is the part people erase when they tell underdog stories after the ending has become respectable. They like inevitability. There was nothing inevitable about my life. Only effort repeated long enough that eventually it began to resemble destiny from the outside. As for Trent, I hear he's a better father than he was a boy. I hope so. Not for him, for his daughter. I never became friends with Sandra Mercer. But every Christmas she sends my mother a handwritten card and me a shorter one tucked inside. Always ending the same way. Still grateful. Still alive. I keep the cards in the drawer by my desk. Not as trophies. As reminders that people can become more honest than they once were. That survival is not always revenge, but it can look like it from far away. And that the room that laughs at you at 16 has no authority over the room you build by 30 if you keep going. If you ask me now what the real revenge was, it was not the shock on Trent Mercer's face in the emergency room. Though yes, that was satisfying in a very human and not especially holy way. It was not the grocery store apology either. Not really. The real revenge was this. He needed me, and I no longer needed him to understand my worth in order to perform it fully. That is freedom. The kind no classroom can give, and no bully can take. Because when I stood over his mother in Bay 4, I was not there as the girl from Cedar Ridge trying to prove a point. I was there as the physician I had become in every hour no one saw. Every bus ride flashcard. Every library shift. Every anatomy lab. Every exhausted, private decision not to quit. That is what saved her. Not spite. Not destiny. Work. Quiet. Humiliating. Relentless work. And maybe that is the deepest justice of all. Not that people who laughed eventually watch you win, but that you become so fully yourself, the old laughter sounds small, even in memory. Still, I remember that classroom sometimes. The torn anatomy poster. The wet hoodies. Trent's voice. Trailer Park Clinic. And I think about the girl I was. Standing there with her face on fire, and her future being publicly rearranged into a joke. I wish I could go back and tell her something useful. Not, don't worry. You'll prove them wrong. That wouldn't have helped. She already knew wanting revenge. What I would tell her is this. The room is not the world. Their imagination is not your ceiling. And one day, when life places a terrified man in front of you and asks what kind of woman you became after they laughed, your answer will matter more than their memory ever did. Mine did. And in the end, that was enough.